Hey guys, welcome back. If you're new here, this is the place where history comes to help you sleep. Not because the stories aren't interesting, they genuinely are, but because we tell them here at a pace that is slow and calm and entirely without urgency. So get yourself arranged. Pillow where it needs to be, blanket pulled up, lights down as far as they'll go. And if you drift off somewhere in the middle of this, that is completely fine. That is, in fact, the entire reason we are here. Tonight we are going to a very specific place at a very specific time. We are going to Salem Village, Massachusetts, in the summer of 1692. And we are going to spend the next hour and a half or so with a woman named Martha Carrier, who woke up on the morning of August 19th, 1692, knowing that it was the last morning she would ever wake up. This is a true story. Martha Carrier was a real person. The events of this night are documented in court records, in witness testimony, in the letters and diaries of people who were there, and in the historical scholarship of the last 3 centuries that has tried, with varying degrees of success, to understand what happened in that small New England village in the year that fear became a legal process. Before we get to Martha, though, before we get to that specific morning and that specific woman, we need to spend some time with the place. Because Salem in 1692 was not simply a location. It was a state of mind. A particular kind of collective anxiety that had been building for years before it found its outlet, and that outlet, when it came, destroyed the lives of dozens of people and ended the lives of 20. Salem Village was not the same as Salem Town. This is a distinction that matters and that the popular retelling tends to collapse. Salem Town was the commercial center, a prosperous port community on the coast of Massachusetts, with merchants and trade and the kind of cosmopolitan bustle that port towns generate. Salem Village was the farming community inland, about 5 miles from the town, populated by agricultural families who had a complicated and frequently contentious relationship with the town that nominally governed them. The village wanted its own church. This was not a trivial desire in Puritan New England. The church was not simply the place where you went on Sunday. It was the organizing institution of the community, the source of moral authority, the mechanism through which social standing was defined and maintained. A community without its own church was, in some meaningful sense, not fully a community. Salem Village had been agitating for its own church for years, and the process of establishing it had been contentious and divisive in ways that left lasting fractures in the community's social fabric. The first minister of Salem Village's new church was a man named Samuel Parris, who arrived in 1689 and who was, by most historical accounts, not particularly well suited to the task of healing a divided community. He was defensive, suspicious, prone to seeing conspiracy and opposition where there may have been simply disagreement, and his sermons had a quality of embattled righteousness that probably did not help. He was paid partly in firewood and partly in the use of the parsonage, and disputes about his compensation became one of the ongoing points of community friction that characterized his ministry. Parris had brought with him to Salem Village a woman named Tituba, who had been enslaved in Barbados and who was now enslaved in his household, performing the domestic labor of the parsonage. He had also brought his daughter Betty, who was 9 years old, and his niece Abigail Williams, who was 11. In January of 1692, Betty Parris and Abigail Williams began behaving strangely. They had fits. They contorted themselves. They said they felt pinched and bitten by invisible forces. They could not explain what was happening to them, or they would not, and the adults around them, working within a framework that assigned supernatural explanations to phenomena that could not otherwise be explained, began to ask the obvious question that their framework produced. Who was doing this to them? The girls named names. Tituba first, which was perhaps the safest name to name since she was enslaved and had no social power to retaliate. Then Sarah Good, a homeless woman who begged from door to door and whose marginality made her an easy target. Then Sarah Osborne, an older woman who had not attended church regularly and who had made the socially irregular decision to live with a man before marrying him. These were the first 3. They were arrested in late February 1692. Tituba, under what pressure we can only imagine, confessed. She said yes, there was a devil in Salem, and yes, she had served him, and yes, there were others who served him too, and she named names that were not her own names to name. The confession was exactly what the examining magistrates wanted to hear, and it opened a door that would not be easily closed. What followed over the next several months was a process that began as the prosecution of a few marginal individuals and expanded, through the mechanism of accusation and the social dynamics of a frightened community, into something much larger and much less explicable. The accusations spread outward from the original core. More names were named. More people were arrested. The prison in Salem filled. The court that had been established to try the accused, the court of Oyer and Terminer, a special court convened specifically for this emergency, began its work. The evidentiary standard that the court applied was the thing that made it particularly dangerous. Spectral evidence was admitted. Spectral evidence meant that an accuser could testify that they had seen the specter, the spirit of the accused tormenting them in visions or dreams, and this testimony was treated as evidence of the accused guilt. The accused person's body might be somewhere else entirely. Their spirit, their specter, could still be doing harm. And since only the afflicted person could see the specter, there was no way to refute the testimony. You could not prove your specter had not been somewhere. You could only deny it and hope that denial was sufficient, and in the court of Oyer and Terminer in the summer of 1692, denial was rarely sufficient. The accused who confessed were not executed. This is the deeply perverse logic of the Salem trials. If you admitted to being a witch, you were imprisoned, but you were not hanged. If you maintained your innocence, you were convicted and you were killed. The legal process had been arranged in such a way that the only path to survival was to lie, to confess to something you had not done. And the people who refused to lie, who stood in front of the court and said, "I am not a witch and I will not say otherwise," those people were hanged. Martha Carrier refused to lie. Let's meet her properly now. Let's spend some time with who she was before the summer of 1692 made her something that history would argue about for the next 300 years. Martha Allen was born around 1649 or 1650 in Andover, Massachusetts, the daughter of Andrew Allen and Faith Ingalls. She grew up in Andover, which was a community about 15 miles north of Salem Village, and her early life was unremarkable in the ways that most early lives in Puritan New England were unremarkable: church, work, the structured and demanding routine of colonial agricultural life. She became remarkable, or rather she became conspicuous, when she married. Her husband was a man named Thomas Carrier, and Thomas Carrier was Welsh, which was already slightly unusual in a community that was primarily English. More significantly, Thomas Carrier was not a member of the Puritan Church, which in a community where church membership was the foundational marker of social standing was a significant social fact. Martha's marriage to an outsider, to someone who did not share the community's religious framework, was the first of several ways in which she positioned herself, or was positioned by circumstances, outside the boundaries of what her community considered normal. There was also the matter of the children. Martha had 2 children, Richard and Andrew, before she married Thomas Carrier, which means she had them out of wedlock, which in Puritan New England was not a minor social transgression. She was brought before the church authorities. She was publicly disciplined. The shame of this was not a private matter in a community where public confession and public censure were the mechanisms through which moral order was maintained. It was known. It was remembered. And in a community where memory of transgression was long and the social consequences of reputation damage persisted for decades, it followed her. Her parents died of smallpox in 1690, along with several other members of her family, in an outbreak that struck Andover. Some neighbors blamed Martha for the outbreak, not on any rational basis, on the basis that she was already a woman with a damaged reputation, already someone whom the community had reason to distrust, and when unexplained illness came, as unexplained illness always came in a world without germ theory, in a world where the causes of infectious disease were invisible, the explanation that the community's framework provided was a spiritual one. Someone had done this. Who had done it? Who was already known to be transgressive, to be outside the proper order of things. The accusation of witchcraft is not, historically, random. It follows patterns. It lands on people who are already marginal, already socially vulnerable, already in some way outside the community's definition of the properly ordered person. Widows, older women without male protection, women who had been publicly censured for moral transgression, women who were argumentative, who did not defer, who did not perform the social submissiveness that their community expected of them. Martha Carrier fit several of these categories, and the category she fit most thoroughly was the last one. She was not submissive. She was not deferential. She said what she thought and she did not soften it, and in 1692 this was a quality that could get you killed. She was arrested in May 1692 on the accusations of several of the Salem village afflicted girls and some Andover residents who had their own reasons for naming her. She was brought before the examining magistrates on May 31st, and the transcript of her examination has survived, and it is one of the more remarkable documents in the Salem record because of what Martha said and how she said it. The afflicted girls went into their fits when she was brought into the room. They writhed. They cried out. They said she was tormenting them. The magistrates asked Martha what she thought of this. She said the girls were liars. They asked her if she was a witch. She said she was not. They asked her if she had made a covenant with the devil. She said she had not, and she never would, and she had no more to do with witchcraft than they did. They pressed her. She did not yield. They told her that her own family had confessed against her, that her sons had said she had recruited them into the devil's service. She called them liars too. Cotton Mather, the prominent Boston minister who would later write an account of the Salem trials, called Martha Carrier the Queen of Hell. He meant it as a condemnation, as a description of her defiance before the court, her refusal to perform the expected submission, her insistence on her innocence in the face of evidence that the court considered overwhelming. The Queen of Hell. She wore it like a title she had not asked for and would not renounce. She was imprisoned in May. She remained in prison through June and July while the trials continued around her. Her 4 children were also arrested, Richard, Andrew, and 2 younger children, Sarah and Thomas, and they were imprisoned with her or near her in the Salem jail. The jail was crowded, and it was hot in the summer, and it was not designed for the number of people it now contained, and the conditions were genuinely terrible in ways that the historical record documents with uncomfortable specificity. People were sick. People were chained. People paid for their own food and their own shackling, because the cost of imprisonment in colonial Massachusetts was borne by the prisoner, and families who could not pay had their properties seized. Martha's 2 youngest children, under pressure and under circumstances that the records describe with deliberate vagueness, eventually confessed. They said their mother was a witch. They said she had brought them to the devil. They were children. They were imprisoned. They were frightened. The confession was the thing that made the imprisonment stop, or at least made the immediate interrogation stop, and children will say what stops the thing that is happening to them. That is not a moral failing. That is a survival response. Martha, who knew what her children had said and why they had said it, did not change her position. She maintained her innocence. She said she was not a witch and she never had been, and no amount of testimony from her own children, extracted under duress, changed what she knew to be true about herself. Her trial was held on August 2, 1692. She was convicted. She was sentenced to death. And on the morning of August 19, 1692, she was taken from the Salem jail to a place called Proctor's Ledge, not Gallows Hill, as it was long called, the actual site having been identified by researchers only in 2016, a rocky outcropping at the edge of what is now a Walgreens parking lot, and she was hanged. She was one of 5 people hanged that day. The others were John Proctor, John Willard, George Burroughs, and George Jacobs Sr. 5 people on one day. The largest single execution of the Salem trials. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. We said we would spend the morning with Martha, the last morning, and that is what we are going to do, slowly, because the morning before a death is not nothing. It is not simply prologue. It is the last ordinary time a person has, and in its ordinariness it contains everything. The jail, the morning, and the women who were still there. The Salem jail in 1692 was not a purpose-built prison in the modern sense. It was a converted building, rough and functional, on Federal Street in Salem Town, not in Salem Village, which is one of the confusions that geography creates for people following this story. The accused were held in Salem Town, tried in Salem Town, and executed in Salem Town, while the accusations had originated primarily in Salem Village 5 miles away. The geography of the crisis is more complicated than the simplified Salem of popular imagination. By August 1692, the jail was seriously overcrowded. The arrests had been accumulating since February, and not everyone who had been arrested had yet been tried, which meant that the population of the jail included people who had been there for months and people who had arrived recently, people who had confessed and people who had not, people who were sick and people who were not yet sick but would be. The smell of the place, described in later accounts by people who had been imprisoned there, was significant. Unwashed bodies, illness, the particular staleness of air that has been breathed too many times, the organic presence of people living in close quarters without adequate sanitation. The chains are worth mentioning specifically because they are one of the details that the popular version of the Salem story tends to omit. Many of the accused were chained. This was partly a security measure and partly a reflection of the belief that a witch's power could be physically constrained, that the chains disrupted the connection between the witch's body and the spiritual forces she commanded. Whether the jailers actually believed this or whether it was simply a convenient rationale for a standard security measure is something that the historical record does not clarify. What the historical record does clarify is that the chains were real, that they were iron, that they were heavy, and that they were worn for months. Martha had been in the jail since late May. That is nearly 3 months. 3 months of chains and heat and crowding and the continuous proximity of suffering that the jail contained. Her children were with her, or near her, in conditions that none of them had chosen, and that the legal system that had put them there showed no particular urgency about improving. The morning of August 19th began the way mornings in the jail began, which is to say it began with the accumulated discomfort of the night finally becoming something that could no longer be slept through. The jail did not have comfortable sleeping arrangements. The straw that served as bedding was old and damp, and whatever comfort it had once provided had been degraded by months of use. The stone walls of the building held the night's cold and then, as the summer progressed, held the day's heat, which meant that the temperature swings between night and day were both felt fully and without the moderation that insulation would have provided. The light that came into the jail in the morning came through small, high windows that did not provide much illumination and provided no view of anything except a strip of sky. Whether it was a good morning or a bad morning outside, whether the August sun was warm and the Massachusetts air was clear, or whether the clouds had come in overnight and the day was gray, was something you could only partially determine from inside the jail. You could see light or the absence of light, and that was mostly what you had. Martha Carrier was 42 or 43 years old on the morning of August 19th. She had been married to Thomas for approximately 15 years. She had 5 children, the 4 who had been imprisoned with her and a 5th who was younger and whose fate during this period is less clearly documented. She had lived her entire life in Massachusetts, in the specific texture of colonial New England life. The church at the center, the seasons organizing everything, the constant physical labor of agricultural existence, the community's eyes always on you and always ready to note and remember. She knew she was going to die today. This is not dramatic speculation. The execution date was set. The sheriff had the warrant. The cart that would take the condemned to the site had been arranged. The date was known to everyone in the jail, and in the town, and almost certainly in Salem Village where the original accusations had been made, and where the news of each trial's outcome had been received with whatever mixture of relief and horror the community was capable of producing. What do you do with a morning when you know it is your last? The historical record does not tell us what Martha Carrier did on the morning of August 19th. The historical record is not interested in the last morning of a condemned woman in the same way that it is interested in the court proceedings that led to her condemnation. We have the trial transcripts. We have the examination records. We have Cotton Mather's account of her defiance. We do not have her own account of her last morning because she did not write one, or if she did it has not survived, and the jail did not keep records of the last conversations of its inmates. What we can reconstruct from the historical record of Salem jail practices, from the accounts of other condemned people of the period, from the general texture of Puritan New England life, is something like what that morning might have looked like. Not certainly, not with the confidence of documented fact, but with the reasonable probability of historical inference. The morning would have included prayer. This is not speculation. Prayer was as automatic as breathing in Puritan New England, and the condemned were encouraged, sometimes required, to spend their final hours in prayer and in the preparation of their souls for the judgment that awaited them. A minister might have visited or might have been present. The relationship between the Salem ministers and the condemned was complicated. Some of the ministers had been enthusiastic supporters of the trials. Others had expressed private reservations that they had not always acted on. But the pastoral function of accompanying the condemned to death was a standard part of ministerial practice. There is a particular quality to prayer when you know it is your last morning. When the usual petitions for health, for the safety of family, for guidance through the day's demands, have been replaced by something more final. When the conversation with God that Puritan theology described as the ongoing relationship between the soul and its maker becomes, specifically and urgently, the preparation of that soul for its imminent judgment. Martha believed in God. There is no reason to think she did not. She had grown up inside the theological framework of Puritan New England, had been shaped by it, had been censured by it and disciplined by it, but had also received from it the categories through which she understood her own existence. She believed she would face judgment. She believed her soul would go somewhere after the body was done. And she believed, presumably, that wherever her soul was going, it was going honestly, without the lie of a false confession to smooth its way. This is one of the things that is hardest to hold in mind about Martha Carrier, that her refusal to confess was not simply stubbornness. It was a theological act. In the framework within which she lived her entire life, a false confession was a lie, and a lie was a sin, and dying with an unrepented sin on your soul was a more serious matter than dying at the end of a rope. She chose the rope over the lie. That is not an easy choice. It is also, in its own way, a profound one. Her children were in the jail. The two who had confessed, the younger ones under whatever pressure the interrogators had applied, and the two who had not. Richard and Andrew Carrier, her eldest sons, had eventually confessed under torture. The word torture appears in the Salem record in connection with their confessions. They were bound in a specific position, neck and heels tied together, until the pain produced the answers that the interrogators wanted. Richard was 17. Andrew was 18. They were boys, effectively, subjected to physical coercion until they said what the court needed them to say about their mother. Martha knew this. The knowledge of what had been done to her children to produce testimony against her was part of what she carried into that last morning. Not just the injustice of her own condemnation, but the specific injustice of having her children used as instruments against her, of having them hurt until they said things that were not true and that would now be part of the official record forever. Her sons had said she was a witch. The court had used this against her. And her sons had said it because they had been physically coerced into saying it, which Martha knew and which the court knew and which did not appear to trouble the court very much at all. The food that morning, if there was food, would have been simple. Cornbread was the staple of colonial New England life at every level of the social hierarchy, though the quality varied considerably. The jail provided food, or rather the jail charged prisoners for food, and the quality of what was provided was not high. Gruel, perhaps. Whatever was cheapest and most practical for a facility that contained more people than it was designed for. The other women in the jail that morning would have been present for Martha's last hours in a way that is worth considering. The jail in August 1692 contained a significant number of women who were waiting for their own trials, or who had confessed and were waiting to see what would happen next, or who had been accused but not yet formally charged. They had been living together in close proximity for weeks or months. They knew each other's stories, their voices, their habits, their moments of despair, and their moments of composure. The community of the condemned is its own kind of community, with its own dynamics of support and competition and shared suffering, and Martha Carrier had been part of it for 3 months. We do not know what the other women said to her on that last morning. We do not know if there were tears or prayers said together, or simply the silence of people who know that words are inadequate and that the only honest response to an inadequate situation is sometimes the absence of speech. We know that some of the other accused women would eventually be released, as the trials wound down in the autumn of 1692 and the court's certainty about its own methods began, slowly and under increasing external pressure, to erode. They would go home. They would try to rebuild lives that had been comprehensively disrupted. They would carry the memory of the jail and the people they had known there, and Martha Carrier's name would be among those memories. Thomas Carrier, and the life that was being left behind. Let's step outside the jail for a moment. Let's go to the farm. Thomas Carrier was still alive in August 1692. He had not been arrested, though his wife and 4 of his children had been. The farm in Andover, the small agricultural property that was the material foundation of the Carrier family's existence, was his to manage alone, or nearly alone, because the labor force of the farm had been largely removed by the arrests. Thomas Carrier is a figure who appears in the historical record mostly in relation to his wife and mostly as a background presence. He is there in the documents but not at their center. He married Martha Allen sometime in the 1670s, knowing that she had 2 children already, knowing that her reputation had been damaged by the circumstances of those children's births, choosing her anyway for reasons that the historical record does not explain but that presumably had something to do with what she was actually like as a person. Her energy, her directness, the quality of mind that Cotton Mather would later call the Queen of Hell, and that Thomas Carrier had presumably experienced, as something more intimate and more specific than that phrase implies. He had watched his wife be arrested in May. He had watched his 4 children be arrested. He had spent the summer farming alone, or with whatever help he could arrange, waiting for a legal process that he had no ability to control or influence. He was not a man of social standing. He was not a man of political connections. He was a Welsh immigrant who had married a woman with a difficult reputation and who was now watching that reputation be used to kill her, and there was nothing he could do about it. The farm in Andover would have been in its summer state on August 19th. The corn would have been growing. Corn was the primary crop of New England agriculture, the crop around which everything else was organized, the crop that the Native Americans of the region had been growing for centuries and that the English colonists had learned to grow because the English crops that worked in England did not always work in New England. The kitchen garden, the small plot close to the house where vegetables for daily use were grown, would have had whatever Martha had planted in the spring before the arrest. Beans, perhaps, squash, the turnips and cabbages that would be needed for the winter. Martha had planted that garden in the spring knowing, or not knowing, that she would not be there to harvest it. She had done the work of planting because the work of planting was what you did in spring, and the knowledge of what was coming was not yet available in the spring of 1692. Not to her, not to anyone. She had knelt in the cold April ground and put seeds in and thought about what she would do with the harvest in September, and the harvest would come in September without her, and Thomas would do what he could with it, and the children who survived the jail would come home to a changed house. The ordinary objects of the Carrier farm are worth spending a moment with because they are the material reality of Martha's daily life, the life that was being ended on August 19th, and they are the kind of objects that historical accounts tend to skip over in favor of the dramatic events. The spinning wheel that Martha would have used to produce the yarn that became the family's clothing. The iron pot that hung over the fire and in which the daily meals were cooked. The Bible. Puritan households had Bibles. The Bible was the central text of daily spiritual life, read aloud at family prayers, consulted in moments of difficulty, the anchor of the theological framework within which the family understood its existence. The beds, crude wooden frames with rope supports and straw mattresses, nothing like the comfortable arrangements that the word bed suggests to modern ears. The chests that held the family's clothing and linens and whatever small valuable objects they possessed. These are the things Martha left behind. Not as a deliberate act of leaving. She had not chosen to leave them, had been taken from them, but as a consequence of the legal process that had removed her from the life they represented. Thomas would use them. The children who came home would use them. The farm would continue as farms do, because the seasons do not pause for grief. What did Thomas Carrier do on the morning of August 19th? We do not know. The historical record does not tell us whether he went to Salem town that day, whether he watched the execution, whether he stayed on the farm because watching was more than he could bear or because someone had to feed the animals, or because the 15 miles between Andover and Salem town was a journey that took most of a day and he had already said whatever needed to be said. Some husbands of the condemned did attend the executions. Some did not. The social pressure on a man whose wife had been convicted of witchcraft was its own particular burden. To attend was to associate yourself publicly with a convicted witch, and to not attend was to be absent from the last moments of your wife's life. There was no good option. There was only the choice between 2 different kinds of impossible, which is a choice that grief frequently presents and that history rarely records the outcome of. Martha had probably seen Thomas during her imprisonment. Visitors were permitted to see the accused under supervision, and it is likely that Thomas had made the journey from Andover to Salem town more than once in the 3 months since May. What they said to each other during those supervised visits is something we cannot know. What a husband and wife say to each other when the wife is in chains and the husband is powerless and the legal machinery has already determined the outcome is something that the historical record has not preserved, because the people in charge of the historical record did not think those conversations worth preserving. They had been married for roughly 15 years. Thomas had known Martha longer than that. He had known her in Andover before the marriage, had known her reputation and her history and chosen her anyway. He had known her through the births of their children, through the smallpox outbreak that had killed her parents, through the years of community suspicion and social friction that had characterized their life in Andover. He had known her on ordinary mornings before any of this happened. Mornings when she woke up and fed the animals and started the fire and began the day's work without knowing that a day was coming that would not be ordinary at all. Let's go back to the jail. Let's go back to Martha on that last morning, because that is where the story is, and we have been outside it long enough. The examination, the conviction, and what Martha said. Before we get to the last hours, we need to go back to the trial itself, because the trial tells us who Martha Carrier was in a way that no other part of the record does. The trial transcript is the document in which Martha Carrier speaks, in which we can hear her voice, filtered through the transcription of a court recorder, filtered through the conventions of legal documentation, but still, unmistakably, a voice with a specific quality that distinguishes it from the voices around it. The examination on May 31st was conducted by the magistrates John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin, the same men who had examined most of the other accused. They had a method. They had a routine. They had seen dozens of accused witches by this point, and they had a way of proceeding that was designed to produce confessions or, failing confessions, to demonstrate guilt through the behavior of the accused in the presence of their accusers. The afflicted girls were brought in. And Putnam, Mary Walcott, Mercy Lewis, Elizabeth Hubbard, the names that appear again and again in the Salem record, the young women whose accusations formed the engine of the trials. When Martha was brought into the room, they went into their fits. This was the standard pattern. The fits were the evidence. The visible suffering of the girls in the accused person's presence was the demonstration of the accused person's guilt. Hathorne asked Martha what she thought of what she was seeing. Martha looked at the fits and said what she thought, which was that it was a shameful thing and that the girls were liars. She did not say it with the trembling uncertainty of someone who was afraid of the power of the court or the power of the accusation. She said it the way you say something when you know it to be true and you do not see any particular reason to pretend otherwise. Hathorne: Is it no wonder to see these so tormented? Martha: No, it is no wonder at all. Hathorne: Have you familiarity with the devil? Martha: No, I have none. This is from the actual transcript. The words are Martha Carrier's words, or close enough to them that they capture the essential quality of her responses, which is directness without qualification and clarity without performance. She was not pleading. She was not weeping. She was not appealing to the court's mercy. She was simply, flatly, consistently saying the truth as she knew it and declining to say anything else. The magistrates pushed. The girls' fits intensified. The transcript records that at certain points during the examination the afflicted girls cried out that Martha's shape was biting them, pinching them, that they could see her tormenting them even as she stood there. Martha's response to each accusation was the same. It was not true, she had not done it. She was not a witch and she never had been, and she would not say otherwise. At one point Hathorne pressed her specifically. You see these poor distressed persons, and you stand making a jest of it. Martha said she did not make a jest of it. She said she was a gospel woman. A gospel woman was a specific designation in Puritan terminology, a term for a woman who lived according to the gospel, who was faithful in her religious practice, who was a proper member of the Christian community. It was a claim to belonging to the same community of faith that the magistrates belonged to, and it was a claim that the court declined to honor. The examination ended with Martha no closer to confession than she had been at its beginning. The afflicted girl's testimony stood. The spectral evidence stood. The court had what it needed or what it believed it needed to proceed. Her trial on August 2nd followed the pattern of the earlier trials. The afflicted testified. The evidence of her examination was entered. Her son's confessions, extracted under what the record delicately calls hard usage, were presented. The jury deliberated and returned a verdict of guilty. The sentence was death by hanging. Martha's response to the verdict is not recorded in the transcript. We do not know what she said, or whether she said anything. We know what she had said throughout the examination and throughout the proceedings, and we can reasonably infer that the verdict did not produce a sudden change in the consistency and clarity that had characterized everything else she said. She had maintained her innocence for 3 months. She maintained it through the trial. She maintained it to the end. Cotton Mather visited the condemned before the execution. He was interested in deathbed confessions, in final words that confirmed the court's verdict and affirmed the theological framework within which the trials had been conducted. He did not get one from Martha Carrier. She told him, according to his own account, that she was innocent. She told the assembled crowd the same thing when the cart brought her to Proctor's ledge. She said she was an innocent person and she was dying for it. This was not an unusual thing for the condemned to say at Salem. Several of the executed declared their innocence at the scaffold. What was unusual about Martha was the consistency and the completeness of it, the absence of any softening, any qualification, any appeal to mercy through the performance of submission. She had been called the Queen of Hell, and she stood at the scaffold as if the title were hers by right and the court's opinion of it was not particularly relevant. August 19th, the last hours. Let's go back to the morning. The last morning. We have been around it and through the context that surrounds it, and now let's sit in it for a while. It is August in Massachusetts. The morning light comes early in August, and it comes gold and clear on the days when the sky is clean. Whether August 19th, 1692 was a clear day or a cloudy one is something the historical record does not specify. We know the general character of New England August, the heat that builds through the morning, the humidity that comes from the sea, the particular quality of light in a landscape of hardwood trees and granite outcroppings that is unlike any other landscape's light. The cart that would take the condemned to the execution site was arranged for late morning or midday. The executions at Salem were public events, conducted at a time when the maximum number of people could attend, because public execution in 17th century New England was partly a legal act and partly a social one. It was a demonstration of the community's power over those who had violated its order. It was also, for the Puritan framework, a spiritual event, the final accounting of a soul before God, witnessed by the community as a reminder of the consequences of transgression. Martha would have known the timing. The jail was not a place of informational isolation. The condemned knew when their time was coming, knew the date, knew the approximate hour. The morning had a shape to it, a direction it was moving in, and the direction was unmistakable. There are practical questions about last mornings that history tends not to ask. What do you do with your body when your body has a finite number of hours remaining to it? Do you eat even when eating seems irrelevant? Do you wash because the habit of washing is too deep to abandon even on the last day? Do you pray continuously, or do you find that the prayers dry up and what remains is simply the fact of the morning? The light through the small high window, the sounds of the jail around you? Martha had her faith. Whatever complicated relationship she had had with the Puritan Church, the public censure of her early life, the community's long memory of her transgressions, the way her faith had been used against her in the trials, she had her faith. She believed in the soul's survival. She believed that what was happening to her body today was not the end of what she was. She believed, presumably, that the God she had been praying to for 42 years knew what she knew, that she was innocent, that the court was wrong, that the spectral evidence was not evidence of anything real, and that this knowledge would matter in a judgment that was higher than the court of Oyer and Terminer. This is not nothing. This is, in fact, a significant thing to carry into the last morning. The certainty that the judgment that matters is not the judgment that has been rendered. That the record that matters is not the record of the court. Her children were in the jail. The younger ones had confessed, which meant they would not be executed, which meant they would survive this. Richard and Andrew, the eldest, had also confessed under torture, which meant the same thing, survival at a cost. The cost was the confession, the official record that said their mother had recruited them to the devil's service. Martha had not recruited them to the devil's service. The official record was wrong and all of them knew it. Did she see her children on the last morning? Did she hold the youngest ones, if they were small enough to hold? Did she say something specific to Richard and Andrew, the sons who had been tortured into testimony against her, the sons who would have to live with that testimony for the rest of their lives? We do not know. We do not have the last conversation between Martha Carrier and her children. It did not survive, or it was never written down, or no one thought it was the kind of thing worth preserving. What we can say is that it happened. That Martha Carrier, on the morning of August 19, 1692, was a mother in a jail cell with her children, and the morning was moving toward the cart, and the cart would move toward the ledge, and she was not going to lie to stop it. That was her choice, and she had made it months ago, and she was not going to unmake it now. The Puritan concept of grace is relevant here. In Puritan theology, the elect, those chosen by God for salvation, demonstrated their election through their conduct, through the quality of their faith, through the steadfastness of their spiritual life. A person who faced death with composure, who maintained their faith under pressure, who did not break before the final accounting. This was a person whose soul was in order. Martha Carrier, standing at the scaffold maintaining her innocence in the face of the court and the crowd and Cotton Mather's watching presence, was performing, in the Puritan framework, a kind of grace. Not the grace of submission to authority, the grace of fidelity to truth. Whether Cotton Mather saw it that way is doubtful. He wrote what he wrote, and he used the language he used, and he left the record he left. But the record is not the only thing that survived. The 5 who died and the world that changed after. Martha Carrier died on August 19, 1692, at Proctor's Ledge in Salem town. She was hanged alongside John Proctor, John Willard, George Burroughs, and George Jacobs Sr. 5 people on one day. George Burroughs was a former minister of Salem Village. He had served there before Samuel Parris, under circumstances that had not been entirely happy for either him or the village, and his arrest and conviction on witchcraft charges had a quality of settling old scores that several contemporaries noted. At the scaffold, Burroughs recited the Lord's Prayer perfectly, which was supposed to be impossible for a witch to do. Witches, it was believed, could not complete the Lord's Prayer without error. He completed it. The crowd was visibly moved. Cotton Mather, who was watching on horseback, told the crowd that the devil could assume the appearance of an angel of light and that a seemingly perfect recitation was not evidence of innocence. The hangings proceeded. John Proctor had been one of the most vocal critics of the trials from the beginning. He had expressed the view, publicly and with force, that the afflicted girls were performing rather than suffering, and that the trials were producing terrible injustice. His wife Elizabeth had also been convicted but was spared execution because she was pregnant. The court did not execute pregnant women, which was one of the few concessions to mercy in its procedural framework. Elizabeth Proctor survived. John did not. 5 people were buried at Proctor's Ledge, in shallow graves at the site of the execution, because the bodies of the executed were not returned to their families in the immediate aftermath. This was part of the punishment, the denial of proper burial, the denial of the rituals through which the community normally marked the transition from life. The bodies were later reclaimed by families, probably, and given some form of proper burial, but the exact disposition of the remains is something that the historical record is not entirely clear about, and the identification of the precise execution site, as recently as 2016, suggests that the physical record was as incompletely preserved as the documentary one. The trials did not end on August 19th. They continued into September and October. 8 more people were executed. One man, Giles Corey, was pressed to death, crushed under heavy stones, because he refused to enter a plea, and without a plea the court could not proceed to trial, and Giles Corey had decided that he would not participate in a process he considered fraudulent. He was 70 years old, and he died over the course of 2 days, with the court's representative periodically asking if he would enter a plea and Giles Corey responding, as the stones were piled higher, with the same 2 words, more weight. The trials ended in October 1692, not because the community suddenly developed a sophisticated understanding of evidentiary standards, but because the accusations had begun to reach people who were too important to be conveniently accused. The wife of the governor of Massachusetts had been named. The wife of the Reverend Increase Mather, one of the most prominent ministers in New England, had been named. When the accusations reached people of sufficient social standing, the framework that had sustained them began to crack, and the crack widened quickly once it started. In January 1693, Governor Phipps dissolved the court of Oyer and Terminer. A new court, applying stricter evidentiary standards and excluding spectral evidence, found most of the remaining accused innocent. The remaining prisoners were released. The crisis was over, officially, though its effects persisted for decades. The aftermath was complicated, as aftermaths to collective injustice usually are. In 1697, the Massachusetts General Court called for a day of fasting and repentance for the events of 1692. Samuel Sewell, one of the judges of the court of Oyer and Terminer, stood in church while the minister read aloud his statement of personal responsibility and remorse, the only one of the judges to make such a public accounting. And Putnam Jr., one of the primary accusers, made a public apology in 1706, 14 years after the trials, in which she attributed her role to the delusion of the devil rather than personal malice, which was either a sincere expression of remorse or a carefully managed deflection of responsibility, or both. The Massachusetts legislature passed a bill in 1711 restoring the good names of those who had been convicted, though the bill initially omitted some names and the process of full legal restoration took considerably longer. Martha Carrier's name was among those eventually cleared. Thomas Carrier outlived his wife by many years. He remarried eventually, as widowed men of the period frequently did, because a farm required two people to sustain it and the social and economic framework of colonial New England was not well designed for single people of either sex. What he felt about Martha, how he processed the loss and the injustice of it, is not something the historical record preserved with any fullness. His children survived. Richard and Andrew, who had given forced testimony against their mother, grew to adulthood. The younger children grew to adulthood. They lived with the knowledge of what had happened, with the official record that said their mother had been a witch, with the community's memory of the accusation and the execution, with whatever private knowledge they carried about what she had actually been like on ordinary mornings before the summer of 1692 turned everything into something else. What the record does and doesn't tell us. There is a particular problem with historical figures who are primarily known through their persecution. The documents that survive about Martha Carrier are almost entirely the documents of the legal process that killed her. The examination transcripts, the court records, Cotton Mather's account, a few references in other Salem-related documents. These are not the documents of a life. They are the documents of a death, and a death that was deliberately produced by a system that was not operating in good faith. What we know about Martha Carrier as a person, as distinct from Martha Carrier as a defendant, is limited to what can be inferred from those documents and from the general historical context of her life. We know she was direct. We know she did not defer easily. We know she had a sharp tongue. Multiple witnesses described her as argumentative, as not managing her words carefully in the way that the social conventions of her time and place required women to manage them. We know she had been publicly censured by the church and had survived that censure and continued living in the same community afterward without apparent change in her fundamental character. We know she was a mother who watched her children be imprisoned and tortured, and who continued to maintain her innocence even when that innocence was being used as the reason they were being hurt. We know she was a wife who had been chosen by a man who knew her history and chose her anyway. We know she was a farmer's wife in colonial New England who would have had the calluses and the physical competence and the practical intelligence that colonial agricultural life produced in the people who survived it. We do not know what she laughed about. We do not know what she and Thomas talked about in the evenings when the work was done and the children were in bed and the fire was burning low. We do not know what she thought about when she was alone, if she was ever alone, which in a household with 5 children and a farm to run was probably not often. We do not know if she had friends in Andover, women she liked and talked to and shared the ordinary exchanges that constitute the social texture of daily life. The historical record preserves the public self, the legal self, the self that was defined by her persecution. The private self is gone. This is true of most people who appear in history through the documents of their persecution rather than the documents of their flourishing. The trial record is not a life record. It is a record of the end of a life, filtered through the perspective of the people who were ending it, and while it preserves some things, the directness of her speech, the consistency of her resistance, it cannot preserve what she was to the people who loved her, what she was to herself on ordinary mornings that were not the last morning, what she knew and thought and felt in the years before 1692 turned everything into a legal proceeding. What we can say, looking at the record in its entirety, is that Martha Carrier was a person who refused, under the most extreme possible circumstances, to become something she was not. She refused to lie. She refused to perform the submission that the court required of her. She refused to make her own survival contingent on the betrayal of her own testimony about herself. She was hanged for this. The people who hanged her believed they were doing the right thing. Samuel Hathorne, Jonathan Corwin, the jury members who deliberated and returned the guilty verdict. They were not, for the most part, sadists or cynics. They were people operating within a framework that told them spectral evidence was real, that witchcraft was a genuine threat to the community, that the afflicted girls were suffering genuinely, and that the proper response to this suffering was to identify and execute the witches causing it. They were wrong. The framework was wrong. The evidence was not evidence. The suffering was either performed or genuinely psychosomatic, and in either case not caused by the people accused of causing it. The wrongness of the framework did not protect the 20 people who were executed. It did not protect the dozens who were imprisoned and who suffered physical and financial consequences that persisted long after the trials ended. It did not protect Martha Carrier's children, who grew up with the official record of their mother's conviction and the private knowledge that the official record was wrong, which is a particular kind of cognitive dissonance to carry through a life. The long aftermath and the strange shape of memory. The Salem witch trials did not end as a result of sudden enlightenment. They ended because the accusations overreached. They ended because the influential began to be accused and the influential had the ability to stop things that the non-influential did not. They ended because Thomas Brattle, a prominent Boston merchant, wrote a letter in October 1692 that circulated among the colony's leadership and outlined, with considerable precision and considerable courage, the specific ways in which the trials were procedurally and evidentarily defective. They ended because the governor's wife had been named and the governor decided that the court needed to be reconsidered. The people who had been accused and imprisoned were released over the winter of 1692 and 1693. Those who had confessed were released. The confession, however false, had served its purpose in demonstrating cooperation with the court. Those who had not confessed and who had not yet been tried were eventually released as the new court standards made conviction essentially impossible. The living survivors went home. Home, in many cases, was not what they had left. Families had been financially devastated by the cost of imprisonment, which, as we mentioned, was borne by the prisoner. Properties had sometimes been seized. Community relationships had been permanently altered by the experience of accusation and betrayal. The people who had accused them were still there, still living in the same village, still going to the same church. The social fabric had been torn in ways that did not easily repair. The families of the executed were in a different position. They had lost a family member to a process that was now understood, by a growing number of people, to have been deeply flawed if not outright fraudulent. They had the official record of the conviction and the execution. They had the community's knowledge of what had happened. They had grief and anger and whatever resources they could muster to try to rebuild in the absence of the person who had been killed. Thomas Carrier and his children had the farm, the objects, the daily round of agricultural life that continued regardless of what had happened in the summer. They had whatever Thomas had managed to preserve of the family's finances during the 3 months of the imprisonment. They had each other and the complicated knowledge of what each of them had done during those 3 months. The confessions under torture, the maintenance of innocence, the choices that the situation had forced on them. Martha's formal legal exoneration came eventually, as part of the broader process by which the colony attempted to address the injustice of the trials. The 1711 Act that restored the good names of the convicted was a legislative acknowledgement that the court had been wrong. It did not restore the lives that had been ended. It did not undo the years of imprisonment and the financial devastation. It did not give Thomas Carrier back his wife or give the Carrier children back their mother. What it did was place a piece of paper in the official record that said the previous piece of paper had been wrong. The site of the executions was lost for a long time. What had been called Gallows Hill by tradition turned out not to be the correct location when researchers began examining it seriously in the 20th century. The actual site, Proctor's Ledge, a small rocky outcropping at the edge of what is now a residential neighborhood, was identified only in 2016 through a combination of historical research, geographical analysis, and careful reading of contemporary descriptions of the execution site. A memorial was established there, with the names of the 20 people who were executed carved in stone. Martha Carrier's name is on the memorial. The Salem witch trials have been written about, analyzed, interpreted, and argued about for 3 centuries. They have been used as a metaphor for political persecution, for the dangers of mass hysteria, for the specific vulnerability of women to accusations of transgression. Arthur Miller used them in 1953 as an allegory for McCarthyism. in a play called The Crucible that generations of students have read in school and that has shaped the popular image of Salem perhaps more than any historical account. The play is powerful and it takes considerable liberties with the historical record, which is what plays do, and the liberties have consequences for how people understand what actually happened. The actual Salem is more complicated than the allegory and more interesting. The actual people are more complicated than the symbolic figures they become in the retelling. Martha Carrier is more complicated than the Queen of Hell or the symbol of unjust persecution, though she was both of those things. She was also a woman who woke up early and fed the animals and planted the garden in the spring and argued with her neighbors and made choices that her community found transgressive and refused, when it counted most, to lie. The refusal to lie is the thing that persists. It persists in the trial transcript where her flat, clear denials are recorded. It persists in the absence of a deathbed confession. It persists in the thing she said at the scaffold, that she was innocent and was dying for it, which is one of the truest things said in Salem in 1692, in a summer that produced a great many official statements that were not true at all. The daily life that preceded everything. We have been talking about Martha Carrier primarily through the lens of 1692, through the trials and the jail and the last morning. But she was 42 or 43 years old when she died, which means she had lived 4 decades in colonial New England before any of this happened, and those 4 decades had a daily life of their own that was not defined by accusation or persecution. Let's spend some time with that life. Not the 1692 life, but the years before it, the life that was ordinary in the ways that colonial New England life was ordinary, which is to say demanding and structured and physical and embedded in a community whose scrutiny was continuous. A colonial New England farmwife's daily life in the 1670s and 1680s was organized around the seasons and around the fire. The fire was the center of the domestic world. It cooked the food, heated the water, warmed the house, dried the wet things, and required constant attention. A fire that went out completely was a serious problem, because relighting it required either preserving a coal from the previous night's fire or borrowing fire from a neighbor, which was both practically inconvenient and socially slightly shaming. Women managed the fire. It was understood as part of the domestic sphere that was theirs to maintain, and maintaining it was not a passive activity. It required tending, feeding, managing, the same ongoing attention that all the living things in the household required. The food that Martha cooked was the food of New England colonial agriculture. Corn was the staple, cornmeal porridge called samp or hasty pudding, cornbread, succotash, which combined corn and beans, the combination that the English colonists had learned from the native peoples of the region and that became foundational to New England cooking. Beans were dried and stored and used through the winter. Salt pork was the primary meat, preserved in barrels of brine that lasted through the cold months. Fish was available. The coastal communities had access to salt fish that was dried and preserved, and the rivers and lakes provided fresh fish when weather and time permitted. Wild game added variety, deer, turkey, whatever the men could bring in. The kitchen garden provided vegetables for the warm months and whatever could be preserved for the winter. Drying, salting, storing in root cellars, these were the preservation techniques available, and they required considerable time and attention in the fall when the harvest was coming in and everything needed to be processed before it spoiled. Martha would have spent weeks each autumn in the work of preservation. Boiling, drying, salting, organizing the root cellar, laying up the stores that would keep the family alive through the Massachusetts winter. The Massachusetts winter was serious. The winters of the late 17th century were, according to climate historians, somewhat colder than modern New England winters as a result of what is called the Little Ice Age, a period of global temperature depression that lasted roughly from the 14th to the 19th century. The winters were long and the cold was genuine, and the adequacy of the preserved food supply was not an abstract question but a concrete one with concrete consequences. Clothing was made at home at this period and in this social stratum. The spinning wheel produced yarn from the raw fiber, wool from sheep, flax from the flax plant that was also grown in kitchen gardens. The yarn was woven into cloth. The cloth was cut and sewn into garments. This is a sequence of labor that modern people, who buy their clothing already made, find difficult to fully appreciate in terms of the time it requires. The production of a single garment, a shirt, a skirt, a pair of breeches, consumed hours that were not available unless they were specifically allocated, which meant that the decision to make a new garment was a decision about time as much as about material. Women worked at fiber in the margins of other work, In the evenings when the day's outdoor and indoor work was done, in the quieter winter months when the agricultural demands were lower, in the spaces between the other tasks that filled every daylight hour and many nighttime ones. The spindle and the spinning wheel were not luxury items or decorative objects. They were tools for survival, and a woman who could not spin and weave and sew was a woman whose household would not be adequately clothed, which in a New England winter was a material problem. Martha had 5 children. The physical reality of 5 pregnancies and 5 deliveries and 5 infants who needed constant care, feeding, cleaning, carrying, protecting from the dozens of ways that colonial New England found to kill small children, was the foundation of her daily life in the 1670s and 1680s. Infant mortality in colonial New England was high by modern standards. Martha had lost 2 children. She had 5 living children, which means she may have given birth to more. The loss of a child was not unusual. It was not accepted without grief. The diaries and letters of colonial New England women are full of grief for dead children. The specific grief of parents who loved their children and lost them to the diseases and accidents that killed children with a regularity that the modern world finds almost impossible to contemplate. The church organized the week. Sunday was the Sabbath, and the Sabbath was observed with a seriousness that modern religious practice rarely approaches. No work on Sunday, not even the fire tending and cooking that daily life required, which meant that Sunday's food was prepared on Saturday and eaten cold, or that the fire was maintained at the minimal level required to keep the house from freezing and no cooking was done. The family walked to church, whatever the weather, because the distance from the farm to the meeting house was not considered an excuse for absence, and absence was noticed and noted. The meeting house was the center of community life. Not just on Sundays, the meeting house was where town meetings were held, where community business was conducted, where the social hierarchy of the community was made visible through the seating arrangement, which in most New England meeting houses was allocated by social standing. The prominent families sat at the front. The less prominent sat further back. The seating arrangement was not random, and it was not merely practical. It was a map of the community's understanding of itself. Martha's place in that community was complicated by her history. The public censure for the births of her first 2 children had permanently altered her social position, marked her as someone who had transgressed and been formally corrected. The memory of this was not short in a community where the same families had been living in the same place for a generation, where everyone knew everyone's history because everyone had been present for it. She had, presumably, made some kind of peace with this. She had continued to live in Andover. She had continued to go to the meeting house. She had married Thomas and had more children and planted her garden and managed her household and done what the daily life of colonial New England required of her. The stigma did not disappear. The accusations of 1692 drew directly on it, used it as evidence of a pre-existing transgressive character, but she had lived within it for nearly 20 years without being destroyed by it, which suggests a resilience and a self-possession that the trial record, in its different way, also demonstrates. She was a difficult woman to like, probably, if you were the kind of person who valued deference and compliance and the smooth management of social surfaces. She was a woman who said what she thought and who did not always manage her words for maximum social comfort, which is a quality that draws some people and repels others and which, in the specific circumstances of Salem 1692, became lethal. She was probably a very good mother. This is inference, but it is inference based on what we know. Her children maintained some contact with her during the imprisonment. They were imprisoned near her. The relationships were not severed by the accusations, even the ones whose confessions had been used against her. The family, damaged and frightened as it was, did not fall apart entirely, which suggests that whatever Martha had built with her children in the years before 1692 had some resilience to it. The morning one more time. Let's go back to August 19th, 1692. Let's go back to the morning one more time, to the jail, to the small high windows and the straw on the floor and the sound of the town beginning to stir outside. The morning had a direction, and the direction was unavoidable. The cart would come. The sheriff would come with the warrant. The 5 condemned would be taken to Proctor's ledge. The crowd would gather, because crowds gathered for executions in the 17th century the way crowds gather for public events now, drawn by the same combination of morbid curiosity and social obligation and the genuine desire to witness important things. The town of Salem in August 1692 had seen executions before. There had been executions earlier in the summer. People knew what to expect. Martha did not know what the crowd would feel. She could not have predicted that George Burroughs would recite the Lord's Prayer perfectly and move the crowd, or that Cotton Mather would then tell the crowd that this did not matter. She could not have predicted exactly how the morning would go, only that it would go in the direction that mornings of that kind went. She could have confessed. Even at the last moment, even on the cart, even at the scaffold, a confession might have stopped it. The court wanted confessions. The court valued confessions. The theological framework within which the court operated placed enormous weight on the last-minute repentance, the deathbed turning, the soul coming to God at the final hour. A confession at the scaffold would have been received with something like relief by the officials present, would have confirmed the verdict and the process, would have closed the narrative in the way the narrative wanted to be closed. She did not confess. She stood at the scaffold and said she was innocent and was dying for it, and then she was gone, and the cart moved back toward the jail, and the crowd dispersed, and the day continued in the way that days continue regardless of what has happened in them. The summer of 1692 continued too. More trials, more convictions, 8 more hangings. The slow turn of the court's confidence as the accusations spread too far and too high. The governor's decision to close the court. The winter releases. The slow, incomplete, never entirely finished process of reckoning with what had happened. And somewhere in Andover, Thomas Carrier finished harvesting the garden that Martha had planted in the spring. The corn that had grown while she was in the jail, the beans and the squash and the turnips, came in September and October. The root cellar was filled. The winter stores were laid up. The fire was tended. The animals were fed. The daily round continued as daily rounds continue, because the seasons do not pause and the work does not pause and the living have to go on living. Martha's children grew up. Richard and Andrew, who had confessed under torture, built their adult lives with the weight of that confession on them and with whatever knowledge of their mother they carried from the years before 1692. The younger children grew up with a mother who was a story, a name on a memorial that would not be built for 300 years, a woman who had died rather than lie. The lie would have been easy, relatively speaking. The lie would have produced imprisonment and eventual release and the possibility of going home to Andover and resuming, in some altered form, the life that had been interrupted. The truth produced the scaffold. Martha knew this and chose the truth anyway. That is the thing about her that the record preserves most clearly, that persists most stubbornly through all the filtering and the transcription and the 3 centuries of distance. The choice, the clear-eyed, consistent, irrevocable choice to say what she knew and to accept the consequences of saying it, in a situation where the consequences were as severe as consequences get. It is late now, very late. August 19th is a long time ago and Salem is a long time ago, and the specific quality of the morning light through the small high window of the Salem jail is something that no one alive has seen. But Martha Carrier was there. She was real. She planted a garden in the spring of 1692, and she said what she knew in the summer of 1692, and she died for it in the August of 1692, and her name is on a stone at Proctor's Ledge in Salem, Massachusetts. The record remembers her. The record got her killed, and then the record kept her. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, about as much as the record can do. Sleep well. Good night.